Good evening. It is truly a pleasure to have the opportunity to come and speak before you here this evening. I am very blessed to have the opportunity to be before you, and it's been a very busy and encouraging and edifying week. Some of you know, because some of you were there, I had a surprise party this week, and then our anniversary for my wife and I was yesterday, and we're getting ready to kick off football season, and I'll be leaving to go to Kansas City tomorrow. So it's been kind of a very busy week, but it's also been very encouraging with all the kind thoughts and prayers and canes and paddle boards and 5-cent pieces and 50-cent pieces, and I'm very blessed, and I thank you so much from the bottom of my heart from this congregation. I do want to clarify something, and this kind of has to go towards the Marshall's grandchildren. If you don't think Randy Van Fossen's old, but you think I do, you got problems, because he's old. I'm not. So one of the kids said Randy Van Fossen wasn't old, but I was. And I'm a little bit, I take a little offense to that. So, anyway, thank you so much for everything, and it is truly a blessing to be here, and it will be a blessing. Hopefully, I'll be here next evening, but I won't be your speaker. I'll be your visitor, and hopefully you'll be encouraged by Brother Currents, and he'll be here next week as we do the shindig, and it's a great opportunity to be edified. And I looked back at some of the pictures from last year, and I still laugh at that one where Daniel's asleep, and I kind of gave him a thumbs up right next to him. So, and I understand I know how tired it is sometimes. So, but I look forward to it, and I hope you do too. Tonight, I'm kind of in this continuous, if you will, about King David, and one of the passages that's talked about there is found there in 1 Samuel about how David, as the king of Judah at the time, the Gibeonites have came and took away not only his kingdom, so to speak, but also his family. And you see that the people were upset with him. And you see that David, a passage I want you to get here tonight, is how he strengthens himself in the Lord. Be mindful, as we talked there last week, that sometimes we have to do things on our own. And this is kind of that example. Even though we have great brethren, we have great comfort in brethren, there is going to be some of those situations that we have to work on our own. And be mindful, even though we think we're alone, we may be all by ourselves, but if we have God with us, we are not really alone. And I want us to be mindful of some of the things that we will talk about here tonight when it comes to the passages of Psalms, when it comes to the difficulties that David goes through, and how he finds an avenue to go and comfort himself in the Lord. And that's something that we as individuals should strive to do as well. We go through a variety of things. We go through a variety of situations. And brother, you are not alone. And I want us to look how David, even though he is not a perfect individual, he is not an individual by any means that has been successful throughout his whole life. But you see, this is why he is a man after God's own heart, because he turns to God for help. He turns to God for answers. And when he has done something wrong, he acknowledges that maybe it's his fault and not necessarily somebody else's. And one of the things that we find ourselves in trouble sometimes with is when we go through these difficulties, we say to ourselves that old song, "Nobody knows the troubles that I've been through." And we use this not only to excuse ourselves when we go through some struggles, but we also use this to excuse ourselves when we do something wrong. And we say that nobody has any idea what I'm going through, and this is why I do blank. And usually we go to Job for our answers, and we talk about how, well, look at Job and all the things that he went through, and yet he didn't sin, and he didn't do things wrong like we see David has done. But David is a great example because this is an individual that decides to turn to God in his biggest of troubles. If you look, for example, how he is constantly pursued by King Saul. One thing I have not found yet, and maybe someone needs to correct me on this, is when I look at David's relationship with Saul, I never see David say something bad about King Saul. Even more, I don't ever see him call Saul king. I see him call him the anointed one, the Lord's anointed. And he reminds us about how he has this preference when it comes to the Lord's anointed that he needs to be taken care of. Think about how David had a piece of his cloth and how he kind of berated his soldiers for letting somebody get that close to him where he could take his life. If you look when Saul does die, and it's a kind of a tragic death, and when somebody tells him about how Saul dies, he says, "Your speech betrays you. And you must be the one that has killed him." And he takes this individual, he makes sure this individual's life ends because he watched the Lord's anointed die. But yet, even though David has this high regard for him, it's not the same back. But yet, he is constantly chased by Saul. And that's another thing we see. He barely escapes several assassination attempts, not only by the Lord's anointed, but also by his own son. And also by we see other individuals that have tried to kill him. And think about how your life is always, you're always like, your head's on a swivel. Because somebody's out there trying to kill you. One of the things I find interesting, maybe I talked about this last week, I truly believe that the reason why Saul was kind of a nut job sometimes, because he knows that when the next king is going to take his place, that usually means one thing's for certain. He's going to die. You think about that. When it came to a king, he didn't just retire or somebody took over and like we see in the presidency today, we see him just, go and he's protected for the rest of his life. Now, usually when a king took over, and you see this even with David, when David dies, there's where a king comes into play. When Saul dies, that's where David comes into play. So when you can see that message that is given to Saul by Samuel from the dead, it says, your life's going to end, you can understand why he's a little bit paranoid. You can see why he's a little bit violent, because he is fearful for his life. So David is no different when we see this kind of similarity where he is fearful for his life. And we see that in his Psalms. We also see, too, that he spent much time hiding in the wilderness. Brethren, when we think of the wilderness in wild, wonderful West Virginia, we think that we're going through over the river and through the woods, maybe petting a couple deer along the way. But the wilderness in West Virginia is not like the wilderness in Judah. Sometimes we're talking about desert. Sometimes we're talking about a place where there is no water. Sometimes we're talking about a place where there is things other than black bear and deer. So when we think about David being in this wilderness, he's not only being concerned for his life when it comes to his enemy, but he's also being concerned about his life against the forces of nature. There's a reason why there were shepherds. There was a reason why we read about these animals coming and taking over. We also see, too, that his entire family was kidnapped on one occasion. One thing that my wife and I has realized is we're losing our children. And it's due to one horrible situation. Girlfriends. I remember talking to my son yesterday and trying to talk to him about, hey, what would you like to do? And the conversation didn't involve, like it used to, me and Peyton doing this. It is what me and Haley is going to do. Haley just graduated yesterday from school, and now they're talking about doing things together. And I'm not in the equation. And I'm okay with it. Tracy, on the other hand, is a different story. And I thought, Tracy, hey, She said, let's get a dog. But it is hard. And the reason why I bring up this point, because if you think about this situation now, jokes aside, here's an individual that has had his family stripped away from him without his permission or without ease. It's in a finger snap. And we also see, too, that while he is thinking about this, there's people talking about getting rid of him. While he is dealing with the same things that they're grieving over, while David is grieving over losing his wives and his children and them being kidnapped, now they're talking within themselves and saying, let's kill him. He's not the king that we need. Let's find somebody else. You know, we talk about how great King David is, but there are some moments that we see David not really being the king that he needs to be. And it's because we really glorify him not only in the Old Testament, but we also do it in the New. But David, at one time, or on more than one occasion, there has been these thoughts about getting rid of him. And then we see this shame of having committed adultery and murder. One of the things I thought about, and it was brought up to me, I think it was by a preacher friend, but he talked about how the roles have changed when it comes to presidents today. During President Eisenhower's presidency, there's been a rumor that he would use racial slurs. And then we're all familiar with the affair that President Clinton had. Imagine if those presidents were reversed. Imagine if Clinton said the racial thing and Eisenhower did the adultery. Eisenhower would have been out of office. So wouldn't have Clinton. And the reason why I bring this up is because here is going to be a scenario where this king, as Nathan warns him, everybody is going to know about this. That's one thing we forget about when it came to David and Bathsheba, is he tried really hard to cover this up. He tried to get Uriah to come to his, or try to get Uriah to go home, spend time with his family. And then when she does tell him that he's pregnant, he thinks it's his. But he wouldn't go home. So that wasn't going to work. So he decides to put him on the front line. And then when he marries Bathsheba, Nathan tells him a scenario, and David gets upset over the scenario and comes to find out that that God that he talks about that has taken this young lamb and prepared it for a visitor, finds out that's David. And Nathan warns him, he says, this is not going to be hidden. People will know about this. Brethren, there is some things that we have been known all of our life for doing something. There's one thing that probably comes to mind when you think of somebody, you think about this situation. That's going to be King David. This great king that was supposed to be the Lord's anointed over Israel is going to be known for trying to get a guy killed because he messed around with his wife. He's got to live with that. And he's got to spend the rest of his life trying to show that he is not that evil guy that has done these things. And then you go to his son Amnon, had done this despicable act to his sister. And the thing, when we talked there in 2 Samuel in our Bible studies at Clarksburg, I said there's 3 sins that he really does that really sticks out. We talked about Bathsheba. We talked about the numbering of the Israelites. I said, this is number 3. And the reason being is because he did not do anything when it came to this despicable act that he has done. He was very complacent, if you think about it. To a point where Absalom takes matter into his own hands. And the impression when I read there in 2 Samuel is this has bothered him for some time. This is not something that he has thought about in a day or in a week or in a month to cool down and maybe he needs to rethink these things. 2 years. He was waiting for his opportunity. And he got it. And he took his life. But once again, how does David respond to this? He doesn't. Absalom leaves. But David doesn't go out to seek him. And when Absalom does come back, there's not really a punishment for him. There's an embrace. He's glad he's back. But this also gives the opportunity for Absalom to say, well, if he's not going to do anything to me, then maybe I'll take something more than just his son's life. I'll take his kingdom. And it became so popular when it comes to Absalom that David flees. And the only thing that he leaves behind is his servants in his house. And then we see Absalom will die. And we see David go into grief. So much grief that Joab kind of chides him, if you think about it. Because think about this. David, when we hear about Absalom, and we see this great concern there about his young Absalom safe, and when he tells him that he has died, he says, Absalom, oh Absalom, my son, I wish it would have been me. And he comes into this mourning, and he stays in this long period of time of grieving over this. And we see that Joab comes to him and goes, King, how dare you? We are the ones that laid down our life so you could live. We're the ones that is trying to make sure that this guy doesn't take over your kingdom. And we're willing to do this with our lives. And you are acting like an individual that finds so much importance in this guy that it feels like we're worthless for doing what we did. That's the king. And he has to deal with that. Because here he's dealing with the loss, and he still has to be a king. And sometimes, brethren, it is hard to be the king and also be a father. It is sometimes hard to be a preacher and be a father. It's sometimes hard to be a police officer and be a father. Sometimes it's hard to be a contractor and be a father. And that should be a reminder that when we think about some of the things that we're going through, some of the challenges that we go through, you're not alone. And some of the situations that you go through, maybe they're worse than David's. But I would make the argument that it's not. Be mindful and be encouraged. When you think about when this situation, when it comes to David, he strengthens himself in God. He doesn't go for a pity party. He doesn't go and play the victim. He strengthens himself in the Lord. He doesn't necessarily focus on what's going on with the people. He doesn't necessarily focus on what's going on with his family. Right now, the important thing that he needs to do right now to come and work on these other things is to strengthen himself in God. One of the things I find very interesting as we look at Psalms 51 verse 3 is he reminds himself that sometimes when it comes to the situations in his life, maybe him. Do we really blame ourselves when it comes to the difficulties that we deal with in life? We say it's someone else's fault is why I'm going through what I'm going through. We do it a lot. This morning, I talked about having 2 hernia operations. The second hernia operation was fantastic. It was easy. I was able to do certain things. It was just all good. The first one, on the other hand, was absolutely horrible. And I cried like a little girl. Because there was times I couldn't get out of bed. There was times I was worried about having a bowel movement because I was worried about trying to move. And And the reason why I believe the second time was a lot easier is because they gave me medication. And I'm not talking about Advil. And brethren, there's a reason why we have an opioid pandemic right now. It's because we find ways to block pain. And it does a very wonderful job at it. To a point that shouldn't shock us when people become addicted to it. Because if I'm able to go do these things without pain, you better believe I want to take it. If I'm going through some horrible headache and I want it to go away before I need to do something, you better believe I'm going to take some aspirin or some Advil for it. If I'm going through some knee problems, and sometimes even a chair gives me knee problems, I'm going to find something to take that way I could walk for a couple hours. We are programmed, not meant, but we are programmed that when it comes to pain, we find a quick avenue for it. And don't think for a second that we don't do it in a mental perspective. We find ways to escape our pain. And people do it sometimes with drugs, people sometimes do it with alcohol, people do it with just a variety of ways to release that pain. David's no different, but David did it a little bit differently. He composed Psalms. If you go to Psalms, I'm being called out, I apologize. But if you go to Psalms 59, verses 1 through 4, you see where the psalmist tells us, he says, "Oh Lord, or deliver me from my enemies, O God. Protect me from those who rise up against me. Deliver me from those who work evil, and save me from bloodthirsty men. For behold, they lie in wait for my life. Fierce men stir up strife against me. From no transgression or sin of mine, O Lord. For no fault of mine, they run and make ready, and awake come to meet me and see." Please don't read Psalms like you do a lot of other passages when you look at some kind of a timeline, if you will. You can't read Psalms like you do Kings. You can't read Psalms like you do Chronicles or Samuel. Because David has collected thoughts. And he's telling us how he feels at a certain moment. He's not God with constant mood swings or anything like that. He's just reflected on some of the things that he has done and think about in his past. And then here in chapter 59, he's talking about being pursued by Saul. And he's telling us that there are some times people have done something against him, but he also reminds us that sometimes when it comes to these troubles, it's not his fault. There's no one to blame. Some people are just evil. Some people are out to do something for no particular reason at all. And that's hard to accept for us because we always want answers for the problems we deal with. We always want some kind of explanation why I'm dealing with this situation. David's dealing with a situation. But he goes to God in Psalm and says, "Help me. Help me overcome these things. Help me deal with these things." You see there in Psalms chapter 56, and he tells us through 1 through 4, he says, "Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me all day long. And all day long an attacker oppresses me. And my enemies trample with me all day long, for they attack me proudly. And when I'm afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me?" A lot of you probably use a King James translation. They'll tell you when they get ready to write a particular psalm, it tells you what's David going through at this time, or what is the writer going through at this time. And David is imprisoned in Gath. Does it sound familiar? Because that's where Goliath is from. And he's in prison here. And he doesn't know if he's going to live the next day or not. But whether he lives or he dies, he puts his trust in God. Whether things will go well or things will go bad, I put my trust in God. Maybe we need to be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they was going to be put in the fiery furnace. He says, if we are going to be put in this fiery furnace, God will save us. He says, but even if he doesn't save us, we're not going to do these things when it comes to bowing down to an idol. That's a sign of great faith. Whether things will go my way or things won't go my way, I'm still sticking with God. And David is telling us the same thing here. Whether things go well with me or things go bad with me, I will stick my faith with God. I will put my trust in him. There's no surprise when it comes to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that there's a fourth individual in that fiery furnace. That's great faith. And this Son of God is reminding us that you're not alone. Can we be individuals that no matter it goes exactly the way I want it or exactly the opposite the way I want it, can we put our full trust in God? Now, I talk about Peyton's girlfriend, Haley. She passed her test yesterday, but I tell you what, the past month and a half for that girl, she's frazzled. Because she took some example test and she didn't pass it. And now she thinks when she takes this test, she's not going to pass it either. So she is spending all this time working plus all this time studying. And I called her out during a sermon. I said, Haley, whether you pass or whether you fail, we still love you and we're still proud of you. And we'll still be here for you. Whether you succeed or fail. That's not just an example of maybe a soon-to-be father-in-law, but that's just an example of how God is when it comes to you and I. He will always love us. If we're willing to follow him, he'll always be with us. And David just asked, what can this world do to me? Go to Psalm chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. This tells you that the timeline is not, there's no timeline in Psalms. Because when we read there in 56 in Gath, and we read there in verse 53 when Saul's chasing him, now when we go to chapter 3, this is where his son is coming and trying to get him. And David reminds us that he has a lot of enemies. And many are rising against him. And many are saying of his soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Not even God can save him, is what his enemies are trying to say to him. And if you're familiar with Jared's sermon, he talks about this is a time to think about what is being said here. When it says Salah. Brethren, there is not one child of God here, or anywhere for that matter, that is striving to do God's will that won't have enemies. And Jesus even warns us of that. He does not only warn us that sometimes we will have enemies if we're striving to do as well. He says sometimes those enemies will be of your own household. And isn't that hard for us to accept or hard for us to grasp that? Because we don't want to be anybody's enemy. But Jesus reminds us that even though he has all this power, he has all this teaching, he has this care and this love for this world, they still killed him. And Paul, with all the smooth sayings that he has and all this knowledge that he has of these individuals and how he approaches individuals, he brings them closer to God, they still killed him. Peter, being this right-hand man of Christ, bringing this perfect sermon, if you will, in Acts chapter 2. And he continues on to doing these things. He says, we'd rather obey God than man. And even this guy and all his perfection was still killed. There won't be many here that will lose their lives for the cause of Christ, like Peter, like Paul, like James. You won't be exiled like John. So may I ask you, what's the problem? If we're not going to lose our lives, if we're not going to be put on a remote island, why does our faith tell us that we feel like we're going to die if we're not everybody's friend? It's just the way things are. And Jesus warns us of this. David warns us of this. You are not alone. If you continue on, as he composed these psalms, he also reminds us that while he's in this wilderness, excuse me, he says, I will bless you as long as I live. I will lift up your hand, or in your name I will lift up my hands. Excuse me. My soul will be satisfied as with fat, rich food. My mouth will praise you with joyful lips. Excuse me. When I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night. He says, no matter what it is, I go to you. When it comes to my Lord, I have learned to be content. Remember the Apostle Paul reminds us whether he has a lot or he has nothing, whether he is rich or where he's poor, or whether he has many or he has no one, he is content. He has learned this. Back when COVID hit, I've got a great appreciation for the Old Testament. And the reason being is because if you follow along the Old Testament, there are some unique things that happen to the children of Israel. And some of those things we'll never have to deal with like the children of Israel. But there's going to be some things that we deal with that the children of Israel will never deal with. And the thing that we should be reminded throughout all the trials and tribulations and all the difficulties and all the faithfulness and the unfaithfulness that has happened with the children of Israel, we should be mindful that God is here for you. Always. The only way that he is separated from you is if you made the choice to separate yourself from him. Look here in Psalm 56, verse 9 through 11, and he tells us, he goes, my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me, and God whose word I praise, and the Lord whose word I praise, and God I trust, and I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? Man can take away your health, man can take away your fortune, man can take away everything that this world has to offer, but the one thing that Jesus reminds us that he cannot take away from you is your soul. And many will find on the day of judgment how valuable that soul is. He continues in verses 59, 16, and 17. He says, I will sing of your strength. I will sing aloud of your steadfast love and mourn. For you have been to me a fortress and a refuge in the day of my distress. Oh, my strength, I will sing praises to you for you, O God, are my fortress and God who shows me steadfast love. I just done a study on Pentecostalism. And I get it. Doesn't mean it's right, but I get it. There was a desire back in the turn of the century, from late 1800s to the new century in 1900s, where people made all these predictions about the Lord coming. And when it didn't happen, people decided to leave because there's no valid point in staying with a religion that has foretold us of these very tragic days, and it just didn't happen. And these individuals, and one of them was D.L. Moody, said, you are missing the point. When it comes to God and when it comes to Christ, it should not be something that is full of boredom. And it should not be something that we just kind of drag our feet along when it comes to worshiping him. And it says we should be like a consuming fire when it comes to our faith. True. But some we can understand that even them, they have taken extremes. But how tragic is it when it comes to the things that God has rewarded us with and all the blessings that God has given us, and the way we show this excitement is we don't show any. Let me continue on here. Just a few things I want to talk about in Psalm 63. In Psalm 63, he talks about how, "O God, you're my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you. As a dry and weary land, there is no water. So I look to you in your sanctuary and beholding your power and glory." And one of the things that we see that David continues to do is when these things have constantly troubled him, he continues to still look for God. And then he continues on there in verses 3, 4, and 5. And he says, "Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. In your name I will lift up my hands. My soul will be satisfied as fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips." It continues on to say, when I talk about you, I will pray and talk about your excellence and glory and how wonderful you are to me. In the world, when we talk about prayer, it should be some kind of request line, or we treat him like a genie. Every tragedy and every difficulty that we go through, we go to God and when we ask him for all the things that he needs to do for us, but we don't do it as much as we do this request about how wonderful he really is. To give him praise. How wonderful he is. How great it is that he still looks out for me. And then verses 6 and 7, he goes, "When I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night, I think about you. I think about you often, because you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy." He's always thinking about him. Last week, I think I told you guys about Ben. And I have this friend. He's a very wonderful guy. I grew up with him in New Martinsville, in Wetzel County. And Ben has been an individual that has been discouraged by religion. What I mean by that is he has seen the hypocrisy. He's seen how Christians act when they should be acting better than that. He has seen the bitterness. He has seen the very horrible things that some brethren have done and given this holier-than-thou attitude. So he has really attacked religion in the past couple weeks. And one of the guys he attacked in particular is a guy named Nick Vujicic. He's from Australia. And Ben has spent the past couple weeks putting very hurtful things about religion, period, on his media page. And one of them was kind of directed at him. Because one of the Vujicic's sayings is something that comes out of the book of Philippians. "I can do all things in Christ who strengthens me." And he decides to kind of make fun of him. He says, "I bet he couldn't do 10 push-ups." So I sent a message to Ben, and I said, "Ben," I said, "do you realize this guy has a pair of tennis shoes in his closet?" He does. In case God gives him the ability to walk again. I said, "Ben," I said, "you're missing the point when we talk about Philippians there. The reason he's able to do the things that strengthens him is not because he's able to walk. He's able to do all these things because he's not able to walk. And whether he's able to walk or not, it doesn't matter. He still has his faith that Christ will help him through everything that he is dealing with. Some of you guys picked on me. I know I do appreciate when people listen to my video sermons in the morning. Some of you guys picked on me, and I do apologize if you saw me drinking the past 2 Sundays. I had an energy drink last Sunday, and this Sunday I had a bottle of water. I didn't even know it was on live. It was a little embarrassing. But if you followed along there a couple weeks back, it's very rare that in the middle of doing one of my video sermons on Facebook that I drop everything. And I did. And the reason being is because Ben was on there. And it really took me by surprise. And he said, "Hey Jay, I just got off night shift. I thought I would just listen to you this morning." There's many times, brother, and I've probably said this quite a few times here. There's many times I get up 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning to prepare a sermon for someone to listen to on social media. And I've been doing it pretty steadily since the pandemic hit. And there's been many times, brethren, that I ask myself, is anybody listening to what I have to say? Should I keep on doing this? Ben was a resounding yes. And he stopped doing the things on social media, which has been encouraging too. Brethren, let's be mindful that God is with us whether we are successful or we're failures. God is with us whether things are going well or things are going bad. It goes back to that song that Gloria Gaither writes, and it's in our songbooks, Because He Lives. And she writes this song because in a time of her life, there's riots in Los Angeles. In a time of her life, the government has been suspect. In a time of her life, it seems like nobody is getting along with each other. At the time of her life, there is racial tension going on. And you may say to yourself, well, that sounds like 2020. But this is 1969 we're talking about here. And she just found out she is pregnant with a child. If you look, I think it's in the 3rd verse of Because He Lives, she talks about having that child. And one of the thoughts that comes through her mind is, how am I going to bring a child in this world? And brother, just fill in the blank with what you're dealing with. How am I going to continue on doing the things in my life when the person that I love very much is no longer with me? How do I continue to do these things in my life when it seems like everybody that is with me seems like they're against me? How do I deal with these things in my life when it seems like there's struggles at home, there's struggles at my job, there's struggles with family, there's struggles with, it just seems like everything is a constant struggle. How am I going to deal with these things? How am I going to deal with being alone? How am I going to deal with just fill in the blank? You're probably sitting there right now saying to yourself, how can I deal with this? Because He lives, I could face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. Because I know He holds the future and life is worth living because He lives. Let that be your reasoning why you can continue on the things that you're dealing with. Because God reminds me that you're worth it. God reminds me that everyone that He has created, He says, It is good. God reminds me that it was worthy enough to sacrifice his only begotten Son on the cross because you're worth it. You are not alone. What can we do to help you out here tonight? What can we remind you here this evening that you are worth it? Baptism is one of those great examples. It's not the putting away the filth of the flesh, but it's a good conscience towards God. When it comes to repentance, I'll tell you what I told my brethren this morning there at Belleville. I went to preach there because of the football clinic I had today. I told them, I said, you think about how Jesus warns them about some of the scenarios that they speak about. He talks about Herod or Pilate going out and killing people who wanted to rebel against him during sacrifice. And it talks about how horrific it was that their blood mingled in the blood of their sacrifices. And it's almost trying to tell you, you think that's bad. Think about the individual that is not willing to repent. And then he goes on and talks about the Tower of Siloam that fell and killed a lot of people. And how tragic that was. And he says, if you think that's bad, think about the individual who is not willing to repent. It's far worse for them. We have an opportunity to repent tonight. Make a change. Maybe we need to pray about something here this evening. Brethren, I got to see some very close friends this morning that he came up to me after service, Dwayne Hickman, and he tells me, he goes, it's 2 years since Cookie passed away. And she was very close to us. And one of the things that is a great encouragement even today is Cookie always made us monster cookies. And when the last time Peyton was there, it was his birthday, and his daughter, Tracy, made him monster cookies. Small things, just like prayer. Prayer does great things for individuals. Small thing, but a great thing. We have an opportunity to do that here as well. Whatever your needs are, let's do something about it here right now. While we stand, while we stand.